What is up, my dashing dude and darling dames? I am the Hans TV, and I hope that you are ready for your dose of idiocracy. It's r/StoriesAboutKevin. Our first post for today comes from Hendrix47. Who learned from who? Because teacher Kevin certainly didn't learn anything. I've known some Kevins and Kevinas in my day, but this Kevin stands out. I haven't seen or spoken to him in nearly a decade, so some of these memories are faded. At the time, Kevin was working as a teacher at an alternative school alongside somebody I knew. Most of these stories are secondhand, but even the most incredible of them struck anyone who knew him as more than plausible. To set the scene, imagine a rather bland white guy in his late 20s who was always way in over his head and still has a smile on his face. This guy was probably the least malicious Kevin you can imagine. But that didn't spare him a few laughs behind his back over his behavior. He was able to teach in the state I lived in, but not his, which was a mere 20 miles away, due to licensing issues. He could pass licensing tests in one but not the other. I forget the exact details, but the difference in standards was a question of a few points on the test, so he just qualified for his job. He drove to work each day by a rather convoluted route. When asked about it, it became clear that he was unaware of the major highways he could have been taking instead. The highlights of his work life include: he once repeatedly excused himself from class and had an associate read words on the elementary school grammar list. After the third time, for one list mind you, it became clear that he did this because he didn't know the words and wanted somebody else to read them out loud. He wanted to argue that the word brain had two syllables, pronounced borain. He argued this point for a while. I recall being told variations of this with other simple words. It happened many times that day, but I forget the other examples. This guy had a degree with a reading emphasis. I don't know where he got it, but I ought to go there and get my doctorate. Clearly, they're handing these things out. Upon looking out the school window onto a quaint Midwestern town and seeing snowfall, he remarked how climate change was obviously a hoax. I thought people like that only existed in political cartoons. Somebody decided to prank him by saying the phone was ringing for him when nobody had called. He answered and thought that it must have disconnected when nobody was there. He fell for this multiple times in 1 hour. When his coworkers tried to point out he was getting pranked, he argued that, "That's what you do when someone gives you a phone, you play along." He would get into arguments with his students that would break down into contradiction between him and a child, going back and forth like the kids going, "Yeah-huh, nuh-uh," in the Emperor's New Groove. This happened more than once. His coworkers would end these in the name of their sanity. For Christmas, he bought everybody at work gift cards to use at a regional chain of gas stations. They had a fair amount of money on them. None of them were activated. This led to multiple cases I heard about with frustrated coworkers trying to pay for gas with useless cards. Surely it can't be entirely his fault, but I've never seen this issue with any other gift card giveaway ever. Maybe it just fits his story to have it work out that way. Outside of work. During his college years, he went to his brother's wedding in the Caribbean. While most guests just stayed the weekend, Kevin decided to stay for a week or two. He was shocked when he returned to school and found out he was in trouble for all of the unexcused absences and late assignments. I am told his mother got everything sorted out. His wife worked nights, and he remarked with pride that he would help her prepare for breakfast each morning by setting her cereal bowl on the table. Nothing else. Not making breakfast and having it ready for when she got back. Not setting out all the various elements of her breakfast in one place so she could do it faster. Just a bowl on the table. He was dumbfounded by how unimpressed his coworkers were at this display of affection. I know I am missing a few great stories, but I hope you've enjoyed reading these. Last I heard, he finally scored 2 more points on his test and is now teaching at a score closer to his place. May God help the students he works with. Question: how does a Kevin become a teacher? Like, my dad's a teacher and I have a massive respect for teachers. How does a Kevin become a teacher? Because you're supposed to be teaching kids things. And if you don't know these things for yourself, how can you teach somebody else them? Our next post comes from Shas Era. Kevin apparently believes the internet runs on magic. So I have recently started a new job working tech support for a well-known internet service provider. My job is to help people fix their problems with their internet, and yes, 99% are elderly or Kevins. This particular Kevin starts out pretty normal. No internet connection, phone not working, etc, etc. I start a test on the line to look for faults, but this can take a while, so I also check the general setup, asking Kevin to confirm what is plugged in and where. Line test comes back clean apart from not getting a signal back from the router, and the setup sounds correct. I even asked Kevin outright if there's any signs of damage to anything, and he says no. I'm at a loss and leaning towards a fault with the equipment. Just as a last shot, I get Kevin to use his mobile to send me a picture. His router is indeed plugged into the correct phone socket. The socket, however, is just lying on the floor. There is no physical connection from the router to the phone line. Is that socket actually connected to anything? No, it fell out of the wall this morning. Well, there's the problem. We'll need to send someone to repair the socket, otherwise nothing is going to work. But I'm supposed to be working from home and my boss is expecting me on a call soon. Can't you just press the button at your end and make it work? So an engineer will be with you on Thursday. Ah, yes. The good old, no, nothing is broken. And then they send a picture. Actually, everything seems pretty broken. Our photo post for today comes from Tiamat234. This Kevin thinks that he knows more about where I was born and lived for 24 years than I do. So, this happened quite a few years ago to me, but on a recent conversation, I remembered about it and thought it would be funny to share. So, my wife's dad's side of the family is filled with the most entitled and brown-nosed people you can think of. They all think they are better than everyone else, even though they really are not. And, well, we usually don't confront them about it, because it just leads to fights, escalation, and things like that. Back when my wife was at the hospital to undergo surgery, I spent a few days at my father-in-law's sister house. Now, this woman is something else. She is extremely condescending. She thinks that her job is the job because she works at the city hall, even though her job isn't that big of a deal. I think she is some sort of glorified secretary or something. She constantly makes up gossip and fake tales to gossip around town just to see other people suffering and is a terrible mother. I could go on for hours about her, but this particular tale isn't about her. Oh no, it's about her husband, Kevin. Kevin is a moron, but he's a moron that thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He will say the most ridiculous things you can imagine, and if you try to talk back or tell him he is wrong, he will throw a fit and rant for hours about how he is right and all these facts that he knows and that you don't. And if you say something like, but there's nothing speaking about this, then he will claim that he won because, see, if you can't find it, it's because you don't know how to research it right. He also has this gambling problem where he spends a load of money on online auctions for broken trucks. Not that he ever repairs them or does anything, he just buys them and leaves them on his backyard to rot. One time I was told by my mother-in-law that he spent over $20,000 on an old truck that only had the metal frame and wheels intact. He claimed that, I can build a 2-floor mobile house with this. And to my knowledge, he never even begun sketching the plans for it. Another thing is that he works as a mason, but he is terrible at it. He never takes measures, lays down the foundations or anything. He just pours cement, lays the bricks, and done. If it stands, then it stands. If it doesn't, then it's the client's fault for messing with it. My father-in-law told me about one time where they were working on a house and Kevin placed the windows and used small wires to hold them in place. Now that you know a bit more about this individual, we can move on to the time where I had my first interaction with the guy. So, I'm from Brazil, more specifically, Rio de Janeiro, and I moved to the rural side of Sao Paulo to live with my wife. Like I said, she had to undergo surgery and I spent a few days at my father-in-law's sister's, for convenience sake, let's call her Karen, house, because it was closer to the hospital to visit my wife, since I couldn't stay in the hospital since it wasn't allowed. One day we all had dinner together. Karen made some cassava manioc. Seriously, America? What the hell is this name? And we were all eating at the dinner room. Then Kevin asked me where I was from and I said Rio de Janeiro. It was my first year there. They still didn't know me all that well. And I thought that was that. He would ask me about the beaches, landscapes, things like that. Then he turned to me and said, "So which factory do you live in?" To which I had to pause for a second to process. I turned to him and said, "What?" And then the following conversation happened. "Yes, in which factory you used to live in? After all, Rio de Janeiro is this giant factory complex." Me, assuming it was some sort of joke, chuckled and said, "Well, I'm from this area." "I've never heard of it. What do they produce?" "I'm sorry?" "Ugh, what do they produce? You know, like chairs or tables or car parts." He said that in an extremely patronizing tone of voice to me, which did make me feel a bit insulted, but I continued to just tag along. None of those things. I live in a condo and he's cutting me off and raising his voice now. As if. I know that state. It's all just factories and mechanical constructions. I've been there before, you know, so I know exactly all about it. But I get it. You must still be having a hard time getting adjusted to Sao Paulo since it's so different from your old factory. After all, here we plant what we eat. We have rural zones and farms to grow our crops and animals, unlike Rio, which just buys everything processed and packaged from us. You'll see how much more healthy we all are. For example, I bet you never had this soup before because over in Rio, it's all just processed and prepackaged food. Here we use our stoves to cook. If you want, I can also show you what oranges are and how we grow them. It comes from trees. So yeah, this guy honestly believed that Rio de Janeiro was nothing but factories as far as the eyes could see, and that we all lived and worked in them. I was honestly expecting this guy to turn to me and ask if I was a robot too. Well, after that last sentence from him, I had to bite my lip hard to not burst out in laughter after hearing so much nonsense. But I wanted to know how far it would go, so I turned around and said, "Alright then, what about our beaches and the Cristo Redentor?" And then Kevin said what was the last straw for me. In an annoyed grunt and a roll of his eyes, he for reals said this. "Oh, come on. Everyone knows that statue's just a fabricated myth. It never existed, and you just say that to make us believe you're like us. Honestly, I find it quite low you'd use the saint name of Jesus in such a lie. But what could I expect from a state filled with people that do not have faith in God?" I could not hold it any longer, and I just burst out in pure laughter. I had a cramp from laughing so much and had to excuse myself outside to stop myself. I was in tears, I laughed so much. The next day I went to visit my wife in the hospital and told her both and my in-laws about that encounter. And we had the laugh of a century. Especially since my mother-in-law told me Karen called her telling how disrespectful I was to her that day and made fun of her husband when he was just trying to educate me. So yeah, that was my encounter with the Kevin. After that day, he never really spoke to me anymore other than hi when we came to visit. I hope you had a laugh as good as I had that day. What's the old saying? Measure twice, cut once? I think they really should have measured twice whenever they were using the intelligence stick to poke this guy with, because he really drew the short end of that stick. Well, alright my dashing dudes and darling dames, that is going to do it for today's episode of r/stories about Kevin. I hope you liked the stories, and if you did, I'm going to link them in the description as always. To everyone who continues to subscribe, thank you so much. And to all my subscribers who are watching my videos, thank you so much. I cannot thank y'all for what y'all do for the videos and what y'all do for the channel. But with that being said, I will see you in the next video.